1. The Golden Mean, Philosophy. The golden mean or path of the golden mean is the desirable middle between two extremes, one of which is excess and the other is lack. It appeared in Greek thought, at least in the Delphic maxim nothing superfluous, and was emphasized in later Aristotelian philosophy. For example, from Aristotle's point of view, courage is a virtue, but if its excess manifests itself as recklessness, and lack as cowardice. History. Western philosophy Crete. The earliest representation of this idea in culture is probably in the mythological Cretan tale of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus, the famous painter of his time, built wings of feathers for himself and his sons so that they could escape from the clutches of King Minos. Daedalus warns his beloved son, whom he loved so much, to fly the middle course, between the sea splashes and the heat of the sun. Icarus did not listen to his father, he flew higher and higher until the sun melted the wax from his wings. For not heeding the average course, he fell into the sea and drowned. Delphi. Another early development is a Doric dictum carved on the façade of the temple at Delphi, nothing superfluous, e.a. Cleobulus. Cleobulus is credited with the maxim, Mpave, moderation is best. 2. Socrates. Socrates teaches that man should know how to choose the middle and avoid extremes on both sides as far as possible. 3. In education, Socrates asks us to consider the effect of either an exclusive devotion to gymnastics or an exclusive devotion to music. He either produced a character of hardness and ferocity, or other gentleness and femininity. Possessing both qualities, he believed that he produced harmony, that is, beauty and goodness. Plato. The relation of proportion to beauty and goodness is emphasized in all of Plato's dialogues, especially in the Republic and Philebus. He writes, Socrates, that any mixture that does not possess in one way or another a measure of the nature of proportion will necessarily spoil its ingredients and, above all, itself. For in this case there would be no mixing, but there would indeed be an unrelated mixing, the destruction of everything that is contained in it. Protarch, absolutely. Socrates, but now we notice that the force of good has found refuge in union with the nature of beauty. For measure and proportion are manifested in all areas of beauty and virtue. Protarch, absolutely. Socrates, but we said that truth also leans with them in our mixture. Protarch, indeed. Socrates, well, then if we can't grasp the good in one form, we have to grasp it in a combination of three, beauty, proportion, and truth. Let us affirm that they should rightly be regarded as unity and be responsible for what is in the mixture, for good is what makes the mixture good in itself. PHLB 646-5a, in the Laws, Plato applies this principle to the election of a government in an ideal state. Elections thus held will strike the middle ground between monarchy and democracy. Aristotle. In the Ethics of Eudemius, Aristotle writes about virtues. Aristotle's theory of virtue ethics is a theory that does not view man's actions as a reflection of his ethics, but rather views a person's character as the cause of his ethics. His constant phrase, it is the middle state between. His psychology of the soul and its virtues is based on the golden mean between extremes. In politics, Aristotle criticizes the Spartan state, criticizing the disproportionate elements of the constitution. For example, they trained men, not women, and they prepared for war but not for peace. This disharmony gave rise to difficulties, which he describes in detail in his work. CMC also a discussion in Nicomachean Ethics of the Middle Ground and Aristotelian ethics in general. Eastern philosophy. Gautama Buddha, 6th century BC, taught about the middle way, the path between the extremes of religious asceticism and worldly indulgence in one's desires. Confucius, in the Analects, written during the warring states of ancient China, c. 479 BC, 221 BC, taught that excess is like scarcity. The lifestyle in the middle is Zhongguyong's way. Zhuangzi was the most famous commentator of the Tao, 369 to 286 BC. Tiruvalluvar, 2nd century BC and 8th century CE, the date is disputed. In his Tirukkural of the Sangam period, Tamazagama writes about a middle state that must preserve justice. He emphasizes this principle and suggests two ways to preserve justice, to be impartial and to avoid excesses. Paramela Jagar was a historical commentator on Tirukkural. Judaism. Main article, Middle Ground, Judaism. The Rambam in the Mishneh Torah attributes this method to the first scholars, Hazal, and Abraham. Indeed, a similar concept exists even in rabbinic literature, Tosefta and Yerushalmi. Yitzhak Aram finds references even in the Bible. One such example is Ecclesiastes 7:15-16, where the preacher exhorts his audience not to be righteous over many things and not to be too evil. Adam Clarke understands the phrase righteous over many as indulging in too much austerity and diligent study and comes to the conclusion that there is no need for all this observation, fasting, prayer, self-denial, etc., you are taking things to the extreme. Why do you want to be considered exceptional and accurate? 7. Thus, the ideal of a middle ground may have existed as early as 600 years before Aristotle. However, some scholars, such as Albert Barnes, hold a slightly different interpretation of Ecclesiastes 7:16-17. Ahead of the time, the Rambam, 1138-1204 CE, probably due to Plato and Aristotle's fascination with ethics, determined that a person should take care of his soul as well as his body, and just as a person who is sick in his body goes to a doctor, a person who has mental disorders. Philosopher or sage. The Rambam opposed the deterministic approach, arguing that man has free will and the ability to change its properties. Christianity. Saint Thomas Aquinas, O.P., medieval Catholic philosopher and theologian, in his Summa Theologia, Prima Secund Partis, question 64, argued that Christian morality is consistent with the average. Evil consists in the inconsistency of their rule or measure. Now this can happen either because they exceed the measure or because they do not reach it. Therefore, it is obvious that moral virtue observes the average. Islam. Islam promotes a middle ground in many cases. The Quran gives an example in the field of finance, in which a person should not spend everything he does, so as not to be caught in need, and not to be stingy, so as not to live a comfortable life. Muhammad also had the saying, meaning that the best choice is the golden mean one. The Quran, chapter The Cow, verse 143, says, "We have made you a balanced, moderate people." The Quran gives the example of two groups of people, calling one of them extremely greedy, chasing the wealth of the world, in the chapter Cow verse 96, and others the inventors of monasticism, excessive zeal in religion, in the chapter Al-Hadid verse number 27. Islam advises its followers to refrain from both of these paths of extremes and to exercise moderation both in the pursuit of peace and in the practice of religion. Last but not least, the Quran emphasizes that the Muslim community, Ummah, is a middle nation / just community / Ummah, a justly balanced / moderate nation / most average nation, Ummatan Wasatan, in verse 243, the middle between extremism and sloppiness. Hinduism. Many Hindu texts emphasize the middle way. For example, in verse 616 of the Gita, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that yoga is not for one who eats too much or eats too little, sleeps too much, or sleeps insufficiently. Rajoguna, hyper, Sattvaguna, balanced, and Tamas, inactive, are the three properties of matter. All foods, things, feelings, thoughts, and more are classified under these three. Ancient philosophy. Modernity. Jacques Maritain, in his Introduction to Philosophy, 1939, uses the idea of a middle ground to place Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy between the shortcomings and extremes of other philosophers and systems. Quotes. In many things, the middle has the best / be my middle station. Phocilides. When Coleridge tried to define beauty, he always returned to one deep thought. Beauty, he said, is unity in diversity. Science is nothing more than a search for unity in the wild diversity of nature, or more precisely, in the diversity of our experience. Poetry, painting, art, it's the same search, as they put it. Coleridge, unity in diversity. If it were not for harmony, which is beautiful for contemplation, science would not be worth following. Henri Poincaré. If a person finds that his nature is inclined or disposed to one of these extremes, he must turn back and improve in order to follow the path of good people, which is the right path. The right path is that middle ground in each group of predispositions common to humanity, namely that predisposition that is equally far from the two extremes in its class, not being closer to one than to the other. Maimonides. What is required is a balance between extravagance and stinginess through moderation, with a view to spacing between both extremes. Al-Ghazali. Middle way, Mahimtipad. In early Buddhist texts, the term middle way, Mahimtipad, was used in the Sutta of the Dhammacakkappavattana, SN 56.11, and its many parallel texts, which the Buddhist tradition considers to be the first teaching that the Buddha uttered after his awakening. Note, in this sutta, the Buddha describes the Noble Eightfold Path as a median path that avoids the extremes of sensual indulgence and self-deprecation. Monks, these two extremes should not be practiced by those who have come out of home life. There is a predilection for indulgence in sensual pleasures that is low, crude, as in ordinary people, unworthy and unprofitable, and there is a predilection for self-deprecation that is painful, undignified, and unprofitable. Avoiding both of these extremes, the perfect one realized the middle way. It gives vision, gives knowledge, and leads to tranquility, insight, enlightenment, and nibbana. And what is this middle way realized by the Tathagata? This is the Noble Eightfold Path, and nothing else, namely, right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right lifestyle, right effort, right mindfulness and right concentration. The middle way does not mean moderation or compromise between the two extremes, rather it means, as the Sutta says, without entering into either of the two extremes, Ubho anti anupagama. Confucius, in the Analects written during the Warring States period of ancient China, c. 479 BC, 221 BC, taught that excess is like scarcity. The lifestyle in the middle is Zhong Guiyong's way. About the golden mean. The concept of the golden mean of morality, as set forth by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, is, in my opinion, an excellent example of philosophical reasoning that meets all the requirements of scientific research. It is very precise, devoid of even a hint of subjectivity, and, as philosophers say, each creates their own philosophy, in the sense of the impossibility of a normal scientific comparison of various philosophical systems, and has an unconditional practical part. If desired, it can be considered prescriptive, although I would not exaggerate the prescriptiveness of this theory, since it assumes that one should act in a certain way, namely, dodging extremes and following a certain middle. Of course, there would be people who would say that such a situation cannot be proven, and it is impossible to refute. However, if we took one of the examples, for example, of a cowardly person and a person who is fearless, completely unaware of what fear is, then the manner of behavior of both would definitely raise questions, in terms of ethics, and generally deny that extremes in behavior cause a number of questions. Very difficult. And at the same time, you should sometimes resort to extreme means, including completely forgetting about fear. However, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but for now I'll quote Aristotle himself. Virtue is reflected in passions and deeds, and in these latter excess is a transgression, and lack too will not be praised, while the middle is commendable and correct. Both, meanwhile, are classified as virtues. Virtue, therefore, is a kind of possession of the middle. In any case, it exists in so far as it reaches it. 1106b, 25. I will give for order in a list of virtues, according to Aristotle. In terms of possessing a disadvantage middle excess I will give for order in a list of virtues, according to Aristotle. In terms of possessing a disadvantage middle excess. With regard to courage, fear, courage. Courage. With regard to pleasure, insensitivity, prudence, promiscuity. With regard to giving and acquiring property, stinginess, generosity, motoring. More to the property, pettiness, splendor, tasteless splendor. In relation to honor and dishonor, belittling, majesty, arrogance. Regarding anger, angry, balanced, angry. As for the truth, narthex, truthful, boastful. Regarding fun, uncouth, wit, buffoonery. 1107b, 1108a. Further, it can be noted that the scientific nature of Aristotle's reasoning is well manifested in the fact that it is very good to start from his concept, in terms of the possibility of adjustments and deepening of reasoning. In other words, it cannot only be said that Aristotle said so, but it can be said in a different way. It is possible to say otherwise, but to ignore Aristotle's reasoning in this case means that in many respects it is easy to ignore the most important layer of reasoning. But if we are talking about a possible deepening and possible adjustment, then Aristotle still did not speak exhaustively. Of course, speaking exhaustively is always problematic. People who are exhaustive on the topic usually just don't dig very deep. Actually, if we think about the criticism of the concept of the golden mean, then the main critical thesis I think would sound like this: at a certain level of tension of forces, the manner of human behavior cannot but be perceived as extreme. At the same time, avoid extremes can be associated with not to strain too much and not to relax too much, with neither hot nor cold, in general with some kind of Philistine position, with the deviation from life in its most vivid manifestations in favor of a calmer existence. But the golden mean is something else. It is enough to think about what masculinity is, and it is clear that the possession of masculinity is something other than the guarantor of some warm existence. In the same way, the possession, for example, of wit indicates some kind of developed skill, far from the usual middle ability to maintain a conversation. And here's how I see the way out of this predicament: should we move the point of the middle? What do I mean by that? And here's the thing: under the point of the golden mean, it is logical to calculate the equidistance point from the 2 points that set the moral half of the scale, and not the scale as a whole. Well, look, we have cowardice and we have courage. Everything that relates to cowardice is immoral, and to courage is moral. The point of the golden mean according to Aristotle was considered the point of equidistance from extreme cowardice and reckless courage as an extreme manifestation of courage. And I propose to consider the golden mean from the point where courage begins, that is, where it comes to moral behavior. The second point remains unchanged. It will be a point of reckless courage, fearlessness. The middle ground divides, I assume, the moral half of the scale in half, rather than separating moral behavior from immoral behavior. According to the figure, this means that the point of the golden mean is not point A0, but point A1. The field of morality as a whole is given by segment A0A2. Cowardice A0, middle A1, courage A2, fearlessness S. By the way, this reasoning can be considered that in its adjustment it is conducted at the prompting of Aristotle, and he was aware of the problem of the middle, saw that the middle is not quite the middle in the sense of equidistance from the two extremes. In some cases it is more opposite to what is lacking, in others it is more opposite to what is excess. For example, courage is more opposed not to courage, in which there is excess, but to cowardice, in which there is a lack. On the contrary, prudence is not so opposed to insensitivity, in which there is some deprivation, as promiscuity consisting in excess. 1109a. That is, we are talking clearly about a tilt in one direction, but I think that the transfer of the point of the golden mean fixes this tilt, and clearly indicates its direction, in the direction of morality. Thus, in relation to masculinity, one cannot judge from one of the edges from cowardice, since cowardice has nothing to do with masculinity at all. Also, truthfulness, for example, is logical to look only on the side of truth, completely excluding the false side from the field of repulsion. And truthfulness begins where a person tells the truth, and the extreme position of truthfulness will be, if you can call it that, truth-telling. We will talk about such a phenomenon as chopping the truth uterus in the eyes. The golden mean, that is, the actual median point of truthfulness, will be the point of equidistance from the beginning of all truthfulness, that is, when a person simply finds the strength to tell the truth, and this is not enough to be considered truthful, and the point when they cut the truth in the eye, and the one who has met with such a truth, I think, understands that such a truth often loses its purpose, and serves only as an instrument of insult. A truth-teller, as soon as he sees some flaw in someone, hurries to the top of his voice to announce his discovery both to the one who has discovered this flaw and to the whole world. And, of course, because it's true. But such an approach, in turn, can be questioned. For another example, I will consider the situation with diligence in its opposition to laziness. It is clear that if a person cannot be called lazy, then he is still far from real hard work, and he has just embarked on this path, although he is already somewhere in the middle between extreme laziness and extreme employment. It is logical to consider the real golden mean from this point of initial diligence, and on the other. At the end of an imaginary segment, we will have a figure of a workaholic who cannot afford himself, and perhaps others, a second of rest. Workaholism, even in its ism, hints at some excess. It seems that it is no longer work, but some kind of intoxication with labor. Actually, for a worker without a breath, labor itself should lose its purpose. For example, someone who builds a house by building a house, having achieved some goal, makes a natural pause. Partly, the builder may need rest as such, he is tired after work, partly he needs to think over a new project, get into it. But you can, of course, from one construction site immediately plunge into another, and then further, and already the house flashes behind the house, and why all this is necessary is not entirely clear. Such workaholism is an extreme that is as useful to avoid as laziness in general. These will be my examples. Further, of course, some problems may arise, if you strictly follow Aristotle's descriptions. As far as specific virtues are concerned, I do not feel completely connected here, although this already blurs the classical scientific approach. The general idea of what is being said here, I think, should be clear. On excess and deficiency, having considered the question of the golden mean, it is now perhaps still worth considering the question of excess and lack in terms of possessing morality. Aristotle considered both lack and excess as an evasion of virtue, while the point of the golden mean fixed as if the only possible, only true way of action. Let us add to this that it is possible to commit transgression in different ways, for evil, as the Pythagoreans figuratively put it, belongs to the infinite, and the good to a certain, while one can do the right thing only in one way. It is not for nothing that the first is easy, and the second is difficult. It's easy to miss. It's hard to hit the target. This, therefore, is the reason that excess and lack are inherent in depravity, and the possession of the middle is virtue. 1106b, 30. But here's what you can think about, after all, if a person tries, if he is hard-working, then this is good. If we believe that he is trying in the name of something good, however, you can be more, and you can be less hard-working. Again, if we take the point of the golden mean, the point of industriousness itself, then should this point be considered a certain standard, or is it rather a certain landmark? I think the latter. This point affects the state of diligence in terms of its real morality, but it does not set any standard. That is, we cannot say that we must be industrious in an equidistant way from the state where laziness begins, and where, on the other hand, a workaholic plows non-stop. Moreover, it is clear that in some cases you simply have to strain more, and in others, less, and this depends directly on the case, on the specifics of a particular situation. So, at this stage, we can come to the following formulation: deviation from the point of the golden mean either in the direction of excess or in the direction of lack does not yet indicate the wrong course of action. It is understandable, only what is on the other side of the moral scale segment unequivocally speaks of the wrong course of action, in the case of hard work, it is laziness. There is nothing moral about being lazy, just as there is nothing immoral about reducing and increasing the level of workload, depending on the requirements of a particular situation. Now, perhaps, I would clarify that the point of the golden mean is the point of the norm of morality. For a moral state, equidistance from the described extremes is normal. The norm in this case means a natural state of morality, in which the morality of the modus operandi does not cause any doubts. For this, equidistance from extremes is needed, in order not to doubt the morality of this or that act. However, when it comes to the absence of doubt, it is almost always worth starting to doubt. As discussed earlier, the moral modus operandi can often seem extreme. In terms of hard work, for example, from the outside it may seem that a person is simply killed. And although the figure of a workaholic, as described, does not cause special sympathies, but in some situations it is necessary to be able to behave like a workaholic, that is, to work without stopping and with the utmost effort. Indeed, and by the standards of morality there may be something abnormal, causing moral doubts. However, if the situation requires, then there is simply no other way out. Further, I would say that it is precisely the ability to evade in both directions from the point of the golden mean of morality that indicates the moral health of a person. And here both sides are important, and it is here that the meaning of highlighting the point of the golden mean manifests itself more clearly. This point is needed, as something from which to start. This is the same, moral, as they say, soil under your feet. Any excessive gravitation in one of the directions will indicate that this point has ceased to be the middle. At the same time, it can still be assumed that the tilt towards extremes in the sense of the direction of morality should be stronger, and a hard-working person will be more drawn to the figure of a workaholic than to indulgences in the sense of diligence. However, this is the same morally natural attraction to workaholism, and must find its counterbalance in evasion in the opposite direction, otherwise we will come to workaholism, in which, as I believe, there is not much good. A0A4. The point of the golden mean, as opposed to the simple middle at point A0, that splits segment A0A4 in half is point A2. This is actually the point of hard work. Further, however, it turns out that the field of morality is narrower than it seems initially, and from the segment A0A4 we move on to the refined field of morality, A1A3, in this case, it is the field of diligence. Both points, A1 and A3, are given through the possibility of deviating from the point of the golden mean towards either the simple middle, A0, or towards workaholism, A4. At the same time, I suggested that the tilt towards workaholism should be stronger, which is reflected in the segment. Mathematically, segment A1A2 is 1/4 of segment A0A2, and segment A2A3 is 3/4 of segment A2A4. But here mathematical accuracy is conditional, at least an order of magnitude more conditional than in the case of the middle point, because there we are still talking about equidistance, and therefore the middle can be understood quite mathematically. The areas A0A1 and A3A4, although they are on the scale of the originally moral, but raise a number of questions. A0A1 speaks of some kind of relaxation diligence, when a person works, but somehow, from the point of view of the refined field of diligence, through the sleeves. It turns out that this is the area of laziness, but within the framework of 2. Morality. Such laziness can still be considered permissible, but as an evasion of the norm. Laziness, which begins beyond the A0 point, actually in the field of laziness, has no moral dimension. Similarly, the reasoning is built about the segment that defines the field of workaholism, A3A4. It's also interesting to think about the A3 point, in the sense of how remote it seems, if you start from the middle, A0. It can be seen that it may well be perceived as an extreme, and, however, this point is in the refined field of the moral, setting one of its boundaries. Well, it seems that this reasoning can be considered over. The golden mean is different every time. Very often, in order to solve a problem, you need to balance everything within yourself. Find a point in yourself when you are not torn between desires and doubts, goals and fears, the desire to act and the need to wait. And when this point, our happy middle ground, is found, then, as a rule, everything happens by itself. This is why this state is so valuable, and that is why, when solving problems, first of all it is worth looking for it, and not to fight with external factors affecting our situation. For the same reason, living through some critical situation and as a result of a long search, finally finding a way out of it, one cannot help but feel the desire to remember exactly what you did and what you thought, at what balance of your moods the point of equilibrium from which the transition to a more prosperous state was made. So that the next time you get into similar conditions, you already know what to look for and what to do to get out of problems as soon as possible. The catch is that the slightest change in the situation, and they never happen exactly at all, brings this previously found equilibrium point to the side. Even the fact that we now know the solution to the previous problem changes it. And therefore it turns out that the previously found solution is no longer suitable. It is not enough to apply the previously made conclusions in order to fix everything. You need to look for something else, a small way, but an amendment, if not something completely different. That is, the golden mean is not some kind of endpoint, in each situation it is different. You can't find a middle ground once and for all, you have to find it again and again. At least that's what happens in our ordinary existence, because in reality, of course, it is possible to find a state where you do not have to look for a middle ground at all, since you will always be in it. But until this happens, we have to learn to cope with individual situations, which, however, brings us closer to the very state of the eternal golden mean. After all, I would like everything to be easier. We will look for it, because it definitely exists. The world of polarities and the path of the golden mean. From self-control to stable balance. The way of containing opposites, avoiding extremes, is called the way of the golden mean. The middle, the center, the neutral state in spiritual practices have a special value. It is in the focus center that the energy flows, ascending from the traveler student and descending from the teacher meet. The lower is spiritualized by the higher. It is through the center that the temporal horizontal comes into contact with the vertical eternity, and the part connects with the whole. Rooting in the spiritual vertical meant establishing a strong connection with the spiritual hierarchy of teachers, because every spiritual teacher on the ladder of ascent is a follower student and has his own master teacher. The word perfection, if you look at the prefix and the root, can be deciphered as joint ascent to the peaks. Few find teachers on earth, few realize that someone or something implicitly teaches him, but each person has his inner teacher, the voice of heart conscience and the voice of intuition. They can be heard only in silence, when the focus of consciousness shifts from the perception of the external noise of everyday life to the inner world. No wonder Christian ascetics sought to master the state of sacred silence, hesychia. It is not easy to get on the path of the golden mean, because human nature is extremely polarized both internally and externally. Passions and painful experiences, constant problems and doubts, a stream of restless thoughts fill the inner world of a person, the cause of which he is inclined to see in a hostile external environment. In this work, an attempt is made to comprehend the principle of the golden mean in the context of the doctrines of opposites, as well as to systematize the ways accumulated in different cultural traditions to achieve the balance of the inner world and harmonize external relations with people. The understanding of the golden mean flowed directly from the principle of opposites, the correct interpretation of which was one of the foundations of life. In ancient teachings, the principle of opposites was understood in line with the ideas of number. Let's consider the most important number symbols related to our topic. The number 1 in numerology is associated with the concept of the center of the world, the prime mover, a fixed unmanifest point with creative power. The creative power of the center flows from the hidden, deep dimension, potentially giving rise to the actual life of the cosmos. Analogies with modern scientific ideas arise. From the state of singularity, mathematical point center, the universe arises as a result of the Big Bang. 3, from an undifferentiated stem cell a complex organism arises. According to ancient teachings, from the point not only origin occurs, but through the point there is also an internal connection with the hierarchical whole. The symbol of 1 also had the meaning of atomicity, indivisible individual integrity, unity in multiplicity. Deuce, or dyad, has a double meaning, symbolizing on the one hand, the idea of opposition, the separation of the one, and on the other hand, the idea of correspondence, homogeneity of opposable forces, properties, or concepts. Opposite principles of opposition in relation to each other and in relation to the center. To understand the principle of the golden mean, the moment of the genetic duality of opposites is important. The internal, deep, hidden, dimension generates an external, superficial, visible. For the human world, polarization becomes a law in its natural organization, social, and personal individual. The features of the principle of opposites are diverse, hence the many models of its understanding. I will list the characteristics, many of which are not universal, but are responsible for the variety of situations. If one opposite principle is involved, then the other also manifests itself. In other words, the entire plane of polarization is activated. With activation, a temporary rhythm of polarity change can come into play, which in the psychological aspect manifests itself when activity is replaced by a decline, joy by grief, and at the same time the emotional power of experiencing joy and intensity will be equivalent to the experience of grief. Hence the advice is to avoid strong emotional upheavals, they are harmful to the body, regardless of their sign. About the universal principle of pulsations in the teaching of life it is said, the principle of Manvantara and Pralaya, that is, the pulsation of phenomena, is manifested in everything. Therefore, it is wise and calm to meet waves of opposite manifestations in the world around us. For more options, the strengthening of one pole entails the strengthening of the opposing one, and, on the contrary, with the attenuation of one pole, the other is also destroyed, and then the active state is replaced by a passive one. IMAGE001. It is worth distinguishing between the following 4 concepts that are most important for understanding the principle of opposites, as well as related strategies of thinking: analytics, dialectics, holism, Dualism. Analytics as a style of thinking shared opposites, but it does not follow that opposites are not connected in a synthesis based on analytics. In dialectics, as a concept of development, the emphasis is on the interaction of opposites. I note that dialectical positions can also be represented analytically. Holism is understood in two main senses: 1. As a strategy of thinking on the basis of monad or integrity, in which case they speak of sequential monism, the most striking example of which is the non-duality of the concept of Advaita Vedanta. Shankara, 2. As a strategy of thinking on the basis of a dyad, when opposites are combined and the role of balance and neutrality, duality, complementarity, are revealed. Dualism means the fundamental irreducibility of one opposition to another, and dualism can have holistic interpretations according to the type of complementarity, particle and wave dualism, in physics, and non-holistic, when the irreconcilability of two principles, points of view, positions, etc., is on the face, followed by the choice of one of them. Classic examples of non-Catholic dualism are Cartesian dualism of body and soul, dualism of idealism and materialism. Dialectical dualism, Yang-Yin dynamics in Chinese teachings, is possible. The golden mean, playing a harmonizing role in the world of cosmic, natural, social, and intrapersonal polar energies, was conceived as the cultivation of states of equilibrium. The stages of acquiring balance and neutrality are many, and the initial steps in this direction are associated with the development of the quality of self-control, understood as dynamic equilibrium. In a passive state, self-control can be defined as the readiness of all the forces of the body to act with full dedication in any situation, and in an active creative state, self-control is characterized by a balance of tension of all the forces of the body. Higher levels of balance are accompanied by an expansion of consciousness and a state that in religious parlance was called apathy or dispassion. Truly great is he who does not care whether happiness or sorrow, who doesn't care if it's cobblestone or gold, who doesn't care whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, who does not care, blasphemy or praise, says Indian wisdom. The consciousness of the sage is outside the world of duality, but can control the dynamics of polarities in the external world from the inside, from the depths of latent reality. Dispassion, or apathy, should be distinguished from external restraint as an indicator of a person's upbringing. With excellent external restraint, internal passions can boil, but a person does not give a look, tries to do it. True dispassion means complete inner peace of feelings, and a stream of disordered, jumping thoughts. Vivekananda describes this state as follows: that man is perfect, who among the greatest silence and solitude finds the most intense activity, and among the intense activity finds the silence and solitude of the desert. He has found the secret of self-control, he has power over himself. He walks through the streets of a big city with its noisy movement, but his mind is calm, as if he were in a cave, where no sound reaches, and all the time his mind works hard. 5. Mastering the senses and mind makes it possible to awaken deep abilities. A person begins to hear the voice of intuition, acquires the ability of correct, instant recognition. Dispassion does not mean the deprivation of feelings at all, but their transformation and refinement, which are expressed in forms of synthetic thinking feeling, when the center of the heart becomes the leading one. In the language of orthodox hesychasm, the process of becoming a whole, harmonious personality was called bringing the mind together in the heart. Due to the harmonization of internal states, thought acquires the power of universal energy. Self-control can be assessed as a focus in which there is a transition from a holistic vision of the situation, instantly intuitive grasping and illumination, to its local awareness, the transformation of the deep continuum into the conscious discrete, quantization of meaning. And to understand the methodology of working with the principle of opposites, this leads to an understanding of the meaning of the zero-point center, the absence of the presence of another, the attenuation of external activities so that the internal deep energies manifest themselves. Achieving balance, self-control, dispassion, a person speaks with eternity. And then the language of non-duality comes into its own. Through the kindness of a human act, eternal goodness acts, through human love eternal love is manifested, etc. When inner self-control is achieved, hidden superconscious forces in a person can be projected onto the ordinary mind and feelings. A person acquires the qualities of a sage, for whom the distinction between good and evil is a matter of the moment of eternity, which contains everything in itself. Here is a quote from the teachings of the Temple. The law of all laws, the law of equilibrium, is the most important among both spiritual and physical laws. This is the immutable and wisest law. On it lies the foundation of all manifested life. It is the root cause and the ultimate consequence of the law of opposites, the law that governs sex and all opposing forces. Without his action, there can be no spiritual, psychic, or material life in the form of. The cross of balance represents the highest achievement, the flowering, the ultimate unity of all the diversity of life. It means, for example, the disappearance of sex in the sex, the victory of the human soul over all that prevents its evolution. When a complete understanding of all that the cross of balance can symbolize overshadows the center of imaginative thinking of an ordinary person, then a connection is established between this center and the center of the brain through which the divine power of intuition acts, and at the same time the meaning, the way of manifestation and the immeasurable importance of the operation of the law of opposites begin to become clear. The main thing that comes at such moments of a person's life experience is the realization of the absolute need to reach a point of development where he can no longer be shaken by opinion, experience, or the desire of any other being, both manifest and invisible. 6. Emotions and thoughts as inner energies. Emotions are bipolar, happiness is opposed by unhappiness, love by hatred, straightforwardness by cunning and hypocrisy, etc. In mastering powerful emotional energies, it is fundamentally important to be able to separate oneself from one's emotions, as an actor does, for example, when working with a role. A high professional actor is distinguished by the ability to portray emotions, or rather, emotional schemes by analogy with schemes concepts, and not to experience them naturally. Separation from the emotion is the first step to its knowledge and mastery. The center of the I goes to the deep dimension, from where self-control becomes truly possible. The path to balance is moderation. Practices have accumulated many methods of balancing emotional energies, if you move on the scale of self-improvement. Avoiding conflict situations, stress, and supporting a positive attitude, mainly moderate joy. Displacement of the dominant, replacement of a negative emotion with a stronger feeling, in other words, the tactics of knocking out the type of wedge with a wedge. Steady development of the positive pole, gradual neutralization, smoothing and elimination of extremes, pacification of emotional incontinence. Transmutation of the negative pole of the feeling into a positive one. Mediation, finding intermediaries and going beyond the specific polarization of energies, persistent self-control as a neutral state. Dispassion as the free management of transformed feelings. Deep neutralization in the state of meditation. Some explanations. At the initial stage of practice, the movement towards the neutrality center is achieved by acquiring the ability to avoid expressions of strong feelings, both negative and positive, because the ecstasy of joy will eventually turn into ecstasy of destructive grief. The strengthening of the positive pole is accompanied by the refinement of the sensual nature. A person can no longer act ugly or unfairly, but we should not forget that it is worth strengthening the opposite pole, namely protection against the negative influence of the environment. In the mastery of emotional polarities, significant importance is attached to positive work, needlework, arts and sciences, physical labor, creating a beneficial environment by avoiding noisy campaigns, chatty friends, etc., choosing the best opportunities, developing the ability to neutralize conflicts and harmonize the external environment, the role of verbal formulas, mastering the orders of thought will, spiritual works. Constant remembrance of the spiritual teacher, mentor, higher power. Not only feelings separately, but the whole complex of emotional, intellectual and moral components, that is, what forms the character of a person, needs to balance the energies. Internal conflict in a person is due not only to the circumstances of life, but also to his nature. The set of character traits, habits, and cognitive characteristics of the personality that determine the inner world and external behavior requires careful and hard work on balance and harmonization. From a cognitive point of view, human consciousness is forced to work with contradictory information in conditions of uncertainty, a spectrum of choices, a palette of contradictory opinions. The subconscious mind often perceives contradictory information due to the relative independence of sensory systems, vision, and touch. It is often difficult to exercise the right to choose, because endless doubts interfere and it is difficult to cope with natural indecision. It is rare to find internally harmonized natures that would not worry, or even tear apart. Doubts would not experience the power of emotions, desires, obsessions, influences from other people and manipulations by the media, etc. The danger of fragmentation of consciousness and disintegration intensifies in the current time of globalization, the complication of interpersonal and social communications, the diversity of ideological, religious, social orientations. The best protection against the chaos of the external environment will be the fluid stability of the inner world, which will allow you to respond sensitively to changes and make consciously balanced choices. Until now, it has been about self-control as a balance that a person needs in life, but there are also special exercises that practice a deeply neutral state. An example is the yogic practice of Sat Nam Rasayan. It is a technique for opening and expanding the space of sensations through deep relaxation, as a result of which the internal forces of the body are activated and self-healing occurs. Not only emotions, but also our judgments are bipolar. Breaking down into eternal pros and cons, bipolarity of judgments is due to ontological and epistemological reasons. In the ontological aspect, the principle of polarity is a law of being that supports movement and development through heterogeneity, multiplicity, and increasingly complex structure. The epistemological aspect of bipolarity is associated with the constructive nature of the cognitive system. Due to the lack of information, most cognitive situations for a person are uncertain. A person is forced to complete mental pictures and construct models, relying on creative imagination. A three-dimensional vision of the situation involves the allocation of its positive and negative aspects, what is called for and against. There may be several alternative scenarios, but their excessive reproduction is not useful, because it supports indecision and inhibiting doubts. The lack of simulated alternatives leads to miscalculations due to one-sided, flat vision. It is clear that the golden mean will lead to success, the development of flexible and mobile thinking, capable of intelligent reproduction of alternatives along with the choice of one of them that will direct this particular action. It is important to observe the proportions. The choice should be like an imperceptible quantum leap in the constant volume vision of alternatives and retro perspectives. It is the constant volumetric vision of the positive and the negative, which for the analytical mind manifests itself in the discussion of the arguments for and against, that will lead to a balancing of the polarities in thinking. The analytical impartiality of the mind is possible with a certain distancing from the object of cognition and its careful consideration. In modern psychology, such a situation is defined as staying in and above the situation at the same time. The volumetricity of vision is achieved at the point of equilibrium. The oscillation of thought between the two opposite poles of inference shows that consciousness is in the center between them and can choose anyone, but it is better to remain at the point of equilibrium, that is, in the center that controls both poles, without giving preference to either. Under this condition, it is easier to understand what is happening at the poles, being ready at each moment to impose the seal of the final decision on their manifestation. Equilibrium is asserted in the center and from the center. The swing of opposites is caused by the existence of a neutral point. When consciousness is at the center of it, rather than at the poles, it can control positive and negative opposites. But at the same time, it should be firmly remembered that there should be no bias and prejudice. Phenomena are perceived with complete neutrality, a balance of consciousness, so that they can speak for themselves, and not a prejudiced thought sent to them. The integrity of thinking requires the harmony of its aspects, spontaneous thinking with the disciplined, critical, logical with the figurative, logical with intuitive, theoretical with pragmatic, virtual with pragmatic. Spontaneous/disciplined opposition is conceived as a vector of manifestations of thinking from chaos, spontaneity, blurriness, uncertainty, unconsciousness or semi-awareness, to order, clarity, certainty, consciousness, the creation of forms, grammatical, logical, structural, figurative. There is also a higher meaning of spontaneity, which yoga practitioners are trying to achieve. With a hierarchical understanding of the levels of consciousness, spontaneity is thought of as a state of free, universal consciousness, which flows like clockwork. In an ordinary person, such a state is experienced as a stream of creative intuition. The path to higher spontaneity lies through discipline and the taming of lower emotional and mental energies, disciplined spontaneity. Disciplined thinking in the European cultural tradition is analytical, but not necessarily of a verbal logical type. Verbal logical strategies are used in scientific cognition in the creation of a system of concepts, models, theories that involve the development of a refined conceptual language. In art, discipline as an analytical activity is realized at the stage of developing the concept of the image, for example, the concept of interpreting a musical work among performers. By virtual thinking, I will understand any internal activity associated with the work of representation, imagination, fantasy, intuition, mental modeling, thought experiment, visualization. In science, virtual thinking in the aspect of spontaneity is associated with imagination, and in the aspect of discipline it tends to systematize, analytical ordering and is abstract. Abstract thinking is also called theoretical thinking. Pragmatic thinking is effective in supporting the ability to external observation and is aimed at the implementation of ideas, models, images, and interpretations in the matter of life, at reading and orientation in specific situations of the external world. Abstract/pragmatic can correspond to opposition, abstract/concrete, general/particular, theoretical/empirical, internal/external. The abstract/pragmatic opposition is again a vector of distinguishable transitions between extreme positions. Ideally balanced thinking can be thought of as centered, but in practice this synthetic state ideal is difficult to achieve. Rather, it should be about mastering different types of thinking, about their correct use in specific situations, about freedom in choosing mental means. Polarization of human relations. Attitude towards enemies. From an energetic point of view, enmity binds no less than friendship, forming its own single field of interactions. It is in vain to think that enemies are something distant and alien. Warring people find themselves on the same plane. Any interaction of opposing forces involves contact with the subsequent formation of common magnetic fields. Due to the difference in individualized life worlds, personality types, levels of cultural development, the emerging emotional and intellectual tension between people is natural. From misunderstanding to ill will and hostility, many steps and transitions can be observed. Often, many people are subjectively perceived as enemies by misunderstanding, forming a single magnetic field. Opponents complement each other. The metamorphosis of the interaction may be unexpected. In addressing the differences in the discussions between Sufis and scholars, Idris Shah quotes Jalaluddin Rumi, if one is clearly opposed to the other, then in reality they may be working together. 9. Seeing only the opposition, people often forget about the interaction of opposites, for example, the initial enmity can end in 3. True friendship, and vice versa. In this light, the famous saying love your enemies takes on a new meaning. The warring are a binary opposition that manifests itself as one force in an invisible deep dimension. The person opposing in the argument can later move to your position and be the best friend. In another situation, one who is immediately captivated by the ideas of another can do a worse service if his perception was superficial. Often, the disciples and followers of the master who knows the truth, by their errors and interpretations, cause greater harm to the teaching than direct enemies. Confrontation in an argument sincerely seeking to get to the bottom of the truth often arises from misunderstanding. Opponents, analyzing the arguments, over time can find out each other's positions, come to an understanding, and the opposition disappears. As Idris Shah emphasizes, reconciliation, familiar to all of us in personal and social relations, is not so much the unification of opposites as the disclosure of the essence of the situation, hidden subjectivity. 10. Another pattern can be observed in social relationships. Often, in order to highlight their point of view, their decision, to emphasize their social status, they act, creating a contrasting background due to the introduction of opposition. The image of the enemy is simply necessary to strengthen the importance of one's position, to assert oneself. Scientific discussions can serve as a confirmation of this. Whether truth is born in an argument is a controversial question, but there is no doubt that confrontation in a mental duel stimulates ingenuity and tempers the creative will. The history of scientific discussions is replete with examples of irreconcilable battles between scientists, when the opponent cannot be persuaded at all, rather, their own positions are better understood and honed to the details. The conclusion suggests itself: if what you have conceived is not done in the fullness of the qualities, then inevitably the other appears, completing the work begun to the whole. A complementary force can be both friendly and hostile. If a friend teaches, the enemy will teach. But in the last version there is a sense, in the tension of the confrontation, perception, attention, thinking and memory are exacerbated. The driving force of counteraction has a valuable quality: it enhances the energy of the process. I love enemies, they polish blood better, admitted Pyotr Gromov, the hero of Vyacheslav Shishkov's novel Ogrium River. Step by step, as he acquires knowledge and experience in overcoming obstacles, a person increases his inner power, forms and polishes the missing facets of consciousness. On the paths of self-improvement, there are certain stages of acquiring experience of interaction with opposing forces, which are due to the development/underdevelopment of certain personality qualities and the level of spirituality. At the first stage, they learn to distinguish opposites and learn by comparison. This applies above all to the fundamental distinction between good and evil, justice and injustice. At the next stage of discipleship, the attitude to the events of life changes. Each event is evaluated according to the criterion of goodness, neutrality, for one's own spiritual development. It was the trials and extraordinary situations that proved to be more valuable compared to the established, but stagnant life. We grow by obstacles, the worse, the better are mottos that reflect this stage of improvement. There is a complex assessment of good and evil. What for an ordinary person is perceived as evil, for the one who follows the path of perfection can be good. The conclusion is that good and evil turn out to be relative concepts or, rather, neutral. They become negative or positive depending on the situation and on the spiritual development of a person. At the highest stage of self-development, the ascetic achieves power over enemies by the fact that any of their actions are redirected towards the good. The negative pole of energy is always transformed into a positive one. Villains can become virtuous, opponents can become friends, the forces of evil can serve ascetics, and jinns build temples, as they say in the teaching of living ethics. Ed. In one of the schools of Buddhism, the ability to dominate enemies is attributed to the qualities of the bodhisattva who has achieved enlightenment. 4 chayokas are 4 streams of perfection. The first is the ability to accept the gift. The second is to get rid of the personality. The third is to show courage, knowing all the dangers. The fourth is to force enemies to work for good. 11 Courage needs no comment. The ability to accept the gift is the ability of a student who knows how to learn and is ready to accept and master the new spiritual gifts of the teacher, new talents and opportunities. Liberation from the personality means liberation from the self and personal egoism, illusions, and blinder habits, including emotional and intellectual ones. It is very important to avoid self-deception and adequately assess your ability to overcome obstacles, which can be expressed in the principle of commensurability, which involves the correlation of internal resources and the forces of external opposition. An analogy with natural processes arises. The principle of opposite in the dynamics of translational motion is reflected by Isaac Newton in the third law of mechanics. The actions of two material points on each other are numerically equal and directed in opposite directions, otherwise, the force of action is equal to the force of reaction. So, the design of the car engine should take into account the friction of the road and air resistance, and the more powerful engine of the rocket, the Earth's gravity and air resistance in the lower atmosphere. In biology, the principle of correlation is concretized in the tense duality of the tendencies of the organism to self-development and self-preservation. The instinct of self-preservation, and/or species conservation, compels one to seek remedies and develops sensitivity to extreme stresses in overcoming obstacles. What is important to keep in mind when perceiving and evaluating another person? First impression assessments are deceiving, and it takes time to observe and learn. But how often do we remember that contact is a two-way process? The principle of commensurability indicates that attention should be directed both outward to the other and inward to oneself. What can influence our own perception of another? Stereotypes of perception. What? Are our evaluations free from the illusions of love or hate? It is clear that the path to perfection lies through the education of self-observation, self-perception, conscious self-government. Knowing the features of your perception, your habits is not easy, and it is almost impossible to know your own possible influences on the object of observation. The influence of his speech, its meaning, words, and intonation, a person does not control. There is no guarantee that what has been said will not cause objections for both objective and subjective reasons. In the informational aspect, the meaning of what is said cannot be detailed for reasons of time constraints. Speech is always open to interpretations, and it is almost impossible to foresee all kinds of reactions. Psycho-emotional control involves understanding the causes of subjective reactions of both one's own and the interlocutors. Direct physical influences can be judged externally, by bodily wounds, and internally, if a person is capable of empathy, of feeling someone else's pain as his own, but indirect wounds for the insensitive psyche are hidden. The trouble is that it is almost impossible to act and reflect on your actions, being aware of and instantly anticipating their consequences. Skills and abilities of self-control, speed of reaction develop gradually, accumulating in unheard thoughts of the situation before and after actions. The attitude to obstacles and opposing forces depends on the level of spiritual development of a person and the state of consciousness. With unconscious or semi-conscious thinking and behavior, a person leads the situation and teaches life itself. He will suffer and fail until he learns to recognize his own problems, which he must learn to solve. Often fate gives one person to torture another, either as a delayed retribution for his own sins, or in order to awaken his will and self-esteem. The oppressor and the oppressed, the predator and the prey in the imperfect world of confrontation, create and perform paired dances of opposites. In a power vortex, the energy of devastation of a person taken to the extreme can cause a clear consciousness of insight and a deep experience of the essence of the situation. Bringing to the extreme, to absurdity, to despair, one of the strategies for transforming energies along the kinship line, hatred turns into awakened love, sparks of the mind arise in the darkness of consciousness. Deeply experienced suffering for a person who has embarked on the path of perfection helps to find the light of reason and hope. A fearless, but not reckless person, thinking and able to weigh his strength, does not rush to provoke conflict, but seeks to maintain peaceful coexistence. Bow to all, and bow to enemies at a distance, Confucius taught. In the book of the Bible, there lived a man in the land of Uz, his name is Job, and this man was blameless, just, and God-fearing, and removed from evil. Job 1:1. Those who have decided to actively oppose evil and realistically assess their own physical and spiritual strength understand that one in the field is not a warrior. The weak seek protection and patronage from the strong, whether a ruler or a sage. But there is no force more powerful than the collective unity of people united by common goals and values. Social reason is called upon to guarantee justice by resolving and preventing conflicts, harmonizing relations between people. Law, morality, traditions are natural regulators of people's behavior in society. Mediation is the oldest method of smoothing out antagonisms, conflicts, and resolving contradictions. Its essence is to remove extreme polarization through intermediaries and thereby dissolve the created exacerbation. In the daily life of a person of traditional society, solving the problems of regulating interpersonal and intergroup relations has always been relevant. Of course, intermediary institutions could have a local effect, spreading within society, while the attitude towards foreigners could be different. Conflict-free strategies by the type of mediators are also used in modern social and political life. The well-known American specialist in the field of management R. Ackoff offers 4 approaches to solving social problems: refusal to take any action in the hope that the problem will disappear by itself, search for partial solutions that mitigate the problem situation to an acceptable state, search for optimal best conditions, dissolution of the problem, dissolution. The latter approach focuses on the search for such changes in the system and the environment, in which the problem seems to have disappeared. Ackoff argues that it was this approach that most often led him to success. 12 special institutions of mediation are created in the practice of political negotiations. With their help the optimization of the negotiation process is achieved. For example, the parties meet with a neutral mediator, who, listening to them, helps to come to a mutually beneficial solution, which is fixed by the relevant legal document, agreement. Often, the mediator does not have the right to make a binding decision for the parties, but only helps them to reach an agreement themselves. When realizing the sufficiency of forces, they embark on the path of fighting the enemy. The struggle can be conducted both by non-force and by force. Peaceful means of resolving conflicts are a way of negotiations, discussions, and compromises. And the main thing is to know each other. Interaction leads to the rise, transformation of the enemy through involvement in the process of communication, imitation, impregnation with ideas and aspirations, learning the language, bringing together the worlds of life. A peaceful way of relieving conflict requires patience, observation, openness of the situation and ingenuity, which constantly creates new opportunities in the flow of counteractions. The peaceful, physically nonviolent path is the way of Christ, the way of love as a universal spiritual force. Free from egoism, love accommodates opposites, cleanses the space of low negative emotions and thoughts, saturates it with light and magnetism of sympathy. Love inspires and wins. In the highest aspects, what the average person is accustomed to thinking as separate is essentially a synthesis of much, or better said, a single one that exhibits many facets. Thus, love in the highest aspect coincides with wisdom, beauty, and humility. Wisdom gives recognition of the true nature of people, humility, non-condemnation, and beauty allows you to find better opportunities for restoring harmony and harmony. If for an ordinary person, when it is impossible to resist the enemy, humility sometimes equals capitulation, a temporary retreat to gather strength, then for a spiritually developed person, humility is impregnated with the higher energies of purity. Purification of the inner space of the soul and the external space of the environment makes it permeable to the response and help of friendly forces. Noteworthy in this sense is the legend of Krishna. One day, Krishna suddenly ran out of the table and just as suddenly soon returned. Entering the house, he sat down at the table and continued the meal as if nothing had happened. Rukmini excitedly asked him, "What happened? Why did you interrupt your lunch so suddenly and run outside?" Krishna replied, "I felt that one of my students needed help, his whole being was attracting me. The villagers stopped him, threw stones at him and insulted him. He stood defenseless and prayed." Rukmini asked in surprise, "Why didn't you come back from halfway and come to his rescue?" Krishna replied, "At first, when he stood defenseless before the people who threatened him, all of Genesis came to his defense, but when he could not stand it and raised the stone in his defense, I realized that he had decided to rely on his own strength." 13. Cleanliness protects. Christian youths, abandoned to be eaten by wild animals by rude persecutors, pacified the beast by faith and prayer. In all religions, there are stories of how the vicious massacre of ignorant people against an ascetic who did not use force for his own salvation led to retribution, repentance, and awareness of what he had done. Many switched to the path of correction and spiritual work on themselves. By tuning in and imbuing ourselves with higher energies, we create a force field that protects against mental and physical influences. Purity provides channels of communication with all being, provides a connection of everything with everything. Purity is a condition for connecting the lower and higher, superficial and deep layers of consciousness. Purity creates the necessary conditions for the action of one's own will. Constantly maintaining the purity of thoughts, desires, feelings, body, surrounding space is the best means of protecting and restoring justice. To awaken the mass consciousness in the fight against ignorance and inertia of consciousness, sometimes a bright flash of heroism was required. The light of the feet, like a ray of celestial bodies, could go on for centuries. According to the verdict of the Inquisition on February 17, 1600, Giordano Bruno was burnt during the Flower Square in Rome during the holiday, proclaiming heliocentrism, the existence of an infinite universe in infinite space, the innumerability of worlds like the world of Earth. At one time, heliocentrism won, paving the way for the nascent science of modern times. Bruno called his teaching heroic enthusiasm, the philosophy of the dawn. He believed that it would reconcile Catholics and Protestants, would contribute to the birth of a new person, an employee of the cosmos. Bruno argued that other worlds are separated from ours only by spatial barriers and that humans are potentially capable of flying to distant worlds at heart. In ancient practices, they specially developed sensitivity to favorable coincidences of circumstances, time and place, when and where it is worth doing what was planned. The Greeks called this auspicious moment kairos. 14. A keen expectation of place and time required endurance, patience, and special intuition. In some cases, they allow negative forces to unfold to the end, or wait in case of impossibility to influence, until they exhaust their energies, and then, when the polarity in social dynamics changes, activate their capabilities. The law of rhythm is based on the tactic of adverge, the worse, the better, which is used if the opposing forces have already manifested themselves at the moment and are rapidly increasing their potential. In times of intensification of the struggle between the forces of light and darkness, it is important to maintain faith and perseverance. The future is as inevitable and inevitable as the daily sunrise. It is also cyclical and subject to rhythm. The rhythm is based on the alternation of opposites, like the beating of the pulse. Adversus tactics, so often used by us, are also based on the use of polarities. We allow the phenomenon to express itself to the end and thereby exhaust its power to replace it with the opposite, when it has already spent its energies. In all that is manifested, one can see its opposite. By allowing something to reveal its essence, we thereby affirm the possibility of manifesting its opposite pole. And the darkness of the night serves as a guarantee of the coming of the shining day. There are no phenomena that are not replaced by their opposite pole. Accurate predictions of events are based on knowledge of this law. Based on it, and the future is yours. Look bright ahead. The light of the future is great. 15. To summarize, in the development of opposite principles in the piggy bank of world experience, there are a lot of funds, however, their choice significantly depends on the correct self-assessment of oneself and one's capabilities. How to find the middle ground? We are used to dividing the world into bad and good, black and white. We easily fall into extremes, from rise to fall, from euphoria to loss of strength, from anger to guilt, etc. We have been taught so it is often very difficult for us to see half-tones, to find a way out of a problem situation, because for this we need to rise above it, to see the situation in perspective, and in the emotional state to which problems lead us. We cannot do this. There are two extremes that lead us to a state of no way out, de-energize us emotionally, and exhaust us physically. The first extreme. Finding a scapegoat. Observe yourself, what is the first reaction to an unpleasant event for you, the behavior of another person, your own failure or mistake? Do you want to find someone to blame, and unleash all your anger on him? We are taught this from childhood. Remember. The child hit the leg of the table. What does mom do? He beats the table with his palm, saying, "Ah, you are not good, hit our baby." What conclusion does the child make? The table is to blame for my pain. More to come. The child was hit by the neighbor's child, and the mother runs to protect her child, to understand and punish the other, and immediately resents his child's behavior, and at the same time the upbringing of his parents. Mom or dad stepped on the foot in the trolley bus, and what does the child hear? "Where do you go? Open your eyes," or the same, but in a milder form, "Look under your feet, do not see that there are people standing nearby." Dad is overtaken on a bend by a dashing driver, and what does dad shout after him? "Well, you're a goat." The goat does not hear this, but the child learns it well, and a stable connection is laid in his brain. If I feel bad, someone else is to blame for this. I need to find this other and tell him everything that bothers me, preferably so that he does not hear, and cannot answer me. The child, like a sponge, absorbs the behavior patterns of parents without subjecting them to analysis, and then all his life subconsciously realizes those scenarios that were learned from childhood, facing the same problems that his parents could not solve. The scenario "the other is to blame for my problem" is absolutely losing. Because in this case, you start a war, you attack the other person, you make him bad, and yourself good. And when you attack, what does the other person have to do? Defensively, of course. He either makes excuses and takes the blame, and with it your problem, and carries it on his shoulders. Or he attacks back, and starts blaming you. In anything, it does not matter the content, the main thing is to confuse the enemy, that is, you. A temporary victory goes to the strongest, the one who has the loudest voice and stronger emotions. What happens after the war? Ruin. Not only the vanquished, but also the victors, restore the destroyed. In terms of human relations, after each such war, trust, sincerity, and the desire to build something further slowly die. By acting on a scapegoat scenario, we give ourselves the right to condemn, retaliate, and punish the other person. Burning with righteous anger and believing ourselves to be right, we easily justify our ugly behavior toward the one we consider guilty. We can yell, we can be silent and not talk for days, we stop doing something for him and wait for him to start begging for forgiveness, we load him with our negative emotions, wanting his pain from us to at least come close to the pain that we experienced from him. And at the same time, we are completely unaware that all the burden of guilt that we place on the other will be on our shoulders, and everything that went from us towards the guilty will come back. We will find ourselves in the same situation, in the role of the same scapegoat. And the whole arsenal of revenge will be used against us. The second extreme. It's all my fault. Also a very common scenario that is born in childhood, when parents very actively scold the child for not meeting their expectations, not behaving as they would like. A lot of prohibit and control every step, blame him for their problems. Because of you I could not arrange a personal life, it's your fault that I am not appreciated at work, you are constantly sick, you me off, you are the cause of all my troubles, because of you my father left. A child who hears something like this unconditionally believes that he is the root of evil in the family. Compare him with other children not in his favor. Look how Lenika studies well, Her parents have no problems, but you. Thus, they form in the child a persistent sense of guilt before everyone and for everything, rewarding him with destructive programs in relation to himself. Such a child will unconsciously act out the following scenarios in life. I am not worthy of happiness. I have to be good for everyone. I bring everyone only problems, I don't need to live. A woman with such attitudes will attract dishonest men into her life who will mock her, accuse her of all sins, and hurt her. A man with a guilt complex will not be able to realize himself in a career, they will be pushed and given those tasks that no one wants to take on. He will be framed, and made guilty in all unpleasant situations. And that's not all. There will come a time when a person who took the blame for everything and everyone simply will not be able to carry it further, he will not have the strength for this. And then he will dump it on those who are weaker, acting on the scenario of finding a scapegoat. These two extremes replace each other, one turns into the other and vice versa, completely exhausting a person, leading him to a state of fatigue and complete inability to understand this life and love himself and other people. We already know that extremes are not a method of solving a problem, that there is always a golden mean that helps to rise above the extremes, to see the situation from a bird's eye view, to understand its origin and cause, and to solve. It is quite difficult from the unaccustomed, because you need to change your worldview, you must first understand the laws of love, the rules by which we live and develop this world, the world of God. To come to the scenario of love, you need to understand that the world is just. This means that any situation that happens to us is aimed at our benefit, at our development. Every situation is created by God, with His knowledge and decision, in order to help us understand that we have gone somewhere wrong. Or vice versa, to support on the right path. Each person is personally responsible for everything that happens to him, both bad and good. This means that I create all the situations around me, my entire environment, my family, my work, my income, my happiness myself by my thoughts, actions, deeds. If a person has little love inside, he will fall into a family in which he will not be put in anything, he will find the same environment, everyone will offend him, and in return he will want to be offended by the whole world. And you just need to understand that in order to improve the situation around you need to clean your heart, your soul from dirt. 4. Every person on our way is our master. God has no hands of his own, and he can teach us love only with the help of other people. This means that every person who has brought us pain shows us our own imperfections. Understanding this law makes it pointless to find a scapegoat. Understanding this gives rise to a feeling of gratitude in the heart to the one who stepped on the foot, he thereby drew attention to our inner inharmonious state. The way I treat myself is how I treat other people. If love doesn't live inside of us, how can we give it to another person? We will only demand love from the other, making him want to push us away, because no one wants to give and receive nothing in return for it. I only get what I give. If you are filled with love, if you generously share it with people, then your life will be filled with harmony and happiness. If this does not happen, and life goes downhill, it means that the energy of love does not live in you, more claims, despondency, resentments and fears come from you, which return to you from other people. Every minute, only the event that happens to me is the one I need at that particular moment. And if it's a nuisance, then that's what I need. We want to control the world, we want to get only good, and we jealously make sure that we are patted on the head. Otherwise, we are judgmental, resentful, or desperate. But a person cannot learn to love without difficulties and troubles, because they are the test of the amount of love in our heart. They managed not to condemn a homeless man and an alcoholic, received a portion of love in their hearts. Understanding these laws, applying them in practice makes extremes unnecessary, leads a person to happiness and harmony. Because we can be happy in this world only when we live according to its laws, according to the laws of God, and not when we begin to set our own rules, and try to adjust the whole world to them. The golden mean is the unity of opposites, excluding extremes. The golden mean is the middle between the extremes, the unity of opposites, excluding the extremes. CM above is a table explaining the scheme of the relationship between the golden mean, opposites and extremes. PC and LC are right and left extremes. PP and LP are right and left opposites. Corner arrows indicate the right and left extremes. The oval connecting the opposites symbolizes the golden mean. An extreme is an opposite, excluding, displacing, not allowing another opposite. Extremes are undesirable or even dangerous. The dangerous extreme is either Scylla or Charybdis. Rushing to the extreme is a violation of the measure. Golden mean is an image symbol of measure. Our disadvantages are an extension of our strengths. All excess is a vice. Antique aphorism. Optimus, it turns out that if something, any dignity, exceeds a certain quantitative boundary and becomes something too intrusive, and then it is definitely a disadvantage, et Paracelsus said, there are no drugs or poisons, it's all about the dose. This statement is true for the person himself. Any excess of a certain measure, dose leads in most cases to undesirable consequences. Pride turns into pride, arrogance, modesty into self-deprecation, caution into cowardice, and courage into recklessness. Tolerance turns into connivance, intolerance into fanaticism. But it is also important not to absolutize the measure, the norm. After all, this is also an extreme. A measure is needed in everything, even in observing it. Food is necessary for a person, but excesses in food lead to obesity and disease. Patriotism is a good thing, but its absolutization in the form of nationalism and chauvinism is dangerous and harmful. Being logical, judicious is good, but in moderation. Otherwise, prudence turns into rationality, and bringing logic to the extreme turns into empty formalism. The golden mean can be like a razor's blade or like walking on a rope. The golden mean can be like a razor's blade or like walking on a rope, balancing a little to the side and fall. In the movie Scaramouche there is a description of such a golden mean: the sword must be held like a bird, you cannot squeeze the handle hard, you will strangle the bird, you cannot weakly squeeze, the bird will fly away. Or this example of the golden mean, notice how deftly an experienced rider holds on to a horse. He sits on it while moving, slightly shifting to the right, then to the left, then forward, to the head, then back, to the croup, or slightly bouncing. An inexperienced rider does not immediately find a middle ground in his body movements, he can move strongly to the right side of the horse or to the left, forward to the horse's head or back to its croup, to the point that he risks falling off the horse. Being between Scylla and Charybdis is another image of such a golden mean. The principle of the golden mean does not always work. The principle of the golden mean does not always work. For example, you cannot look for a middle ground between good and evil, life and death. Also, you cannot look for a middle ground between intelligence and stupidity. If the mind is not always good, as my opponent claims, then stupidity can be good. This conclusion follows from his statement. The darkness of the clever paradoxalists is ready to recognize stupidity in some cases as good, and the mind as evil. Especially if the words mind and stupidity are used not in their main meanings, but in peripheral, so to speak, little-used meanings. The mind is therefore the mind, that it serves the good, in the fundamental sense, and not evil. This is a truism. And my opponent is trying to challenge this truism. In cases where the mind is not good, it is no longer the mind, but stupidity. Aristotle's problem of moderation of the senses, which he outlined in his doctrine of ethics. The moderation of the senses is the dream of every true philosopher, since only dispassion, peace of mind and feelings allow one to gain true, objective knowledge about the world and man. And in order to achieve moderation of feelings, philosophers proposed many recipes and techniques. But their main idea is to constantly work on yourself and slowly, step by step, approach the ideal, dispassion. A continuation of Aristotle's ethical teaching is the assumption that there is a measure in the virtues. It should be said that the virtues were interpreted by ancient Greek philosophers very differently, as the desire for knowledge, as the moderation of feelings and passions, as the intention of a person to withdraw from worldly affairs and devote himself to reflection. For Aristotle, virtue is moderation in everything, in passions, in actions, in the timbre of the voice, in desires and needs. For example, the virtue of courage is interpreted by Aristotle as the middle between cowardice and reckless bravery, and generosity is the middle between stinginess and motorism. The way of the golden mean. The way of the golden mean is the methodology of Confucius's reformism and one of the main links in his ideology. Confucius said, the golden mean, as a virtuous principle, is the highest principle, but the people no longer possess it. Luan Yu, Chapter 7. The term golden mean is used in the Luan Yu only once in the above quote, and it is not explained. Only in the commentary to the Luan Yu is it explained, hold in your hands two extremes, but use for the people the middle lying between them. Luan Yu, ch. 7. This is the principle of keep two ends, but use the middle, according to which a middle way is chosen between two contradictions that stand against each other, which does not allow both excessiveness and lag, in order to mitigate contradictions and prevent their aggravation. In fact, it is a theory of compromise and a theory of mitigation of contradictions. Assessing his disciples, Confucius said, Shi, aka Zhang, is excessive, Shang, aka Xia, is lagging behind, and then added, excessiveness is as bad as lagging behind. Luan Yu, Chapter 14. As Confucius believed, Zhang showed excessive haste, he was excessive, and Xia was treading water, lagging behind. None of them met the concept of the way of the golden mean. It is easy to see that avoiding excessiveness and lagging behind is the golden mean. In other words, the golden mean is the mitigation of contradictions and a compromise between excessiveness and lagging behind, two ends. In addition, Confucius said, when you do not find a person who adheres to the middle to make friends with him, you necessarily encounter either the unrestrained or the cautious. The unrestrained tend forward, but the cautious do nothing. Luo Niu, Chapter 16. In real life, if there is no person who adheres to the golden mean, with whom it would be possible to maintain friendly relations, you always have to establish connections with people who are too intemperate or cautious. The unrestrained actively strive forward, the cautious show passivity and trample on the spot. This can also be seen as the fact that moving along the middle way without showing intemperance and caution is the golden mean. Based on the idea of walking in the middle, Confucius opposed anything that could be called extremism or extreme. He said, "Great hatred of a man devoid of humanity leads to confusion." Luo Niu, Chapter 9. In other words, the manifestation of great hatred towards a person who does not have humanity can lead to trouble, since the aggravation of contradictions can cause confusion. Ideas expressed by Confucius on the implementation of good governance: dressers, love for people, generosity and mercy, non-conduct of cruel policies against the people, etc. All these are specific expressions of the concept of golden mean, the purpose of which was to mitigate contradictions and suppress resistance. Assessing the Shi Qing, Confucius said, Song. The meeting of the bride, being joyful, is not obscene, being sad does not hurt. Luo Niu, ch. 14, that is, a song that is cheerful, but not unbridled evokes sadness, but does not cause sorrow. Listing the requirements for a ruler, Confucius pointed out that he should be majestic, but not arrogant, strict, but not cruel. Luo Niu, ch. 23. In the Luo Niu, we find that Confucius fished with a fishing rod rather than a net, hunting, did not shoot birds that had settled down for the night. Luo Niu, Chapter 8. From the point of view of Confucius, catching fish with nets and shooting birds sleeping in the nest is excessive and does not correspond to the path of the golden mean. It was in this connection that Mencius said, Zongni did not do anything excessive. Mencius, Chapter 8, expressing in these words great praise for the golden mean, for which Confucius spoke. Confucius' disciple Yu Zhou used the idea of the golden mean to explain the rules of conduct, saying, "The use of rules of conduct is valued because it leads to harmony, and it is because of this that the way of ancient rulers was beautiful." Luo Niu, Chapter 1. Harmony, which Yu Zhou spoke about, is a compromise of the excessive with the laggard, the basic principle in the rules of behavior. In everything you need to act in accordance with the rules of behavior, strive to follow the path of the golden mean. At the same time, Yu Zhou pointed out, it is also wrong to establish harmony for the sake of achieving the golden mean, but not to limit it to the rules of behavior. Luo Niu, Chapter 1. In these words, Yu Zhou revealed one of the basic principles of the golden mean, namely, it is impossible to unprincipled compromise for the sake of compromise. It is necessary to remember to protect the rules of conduct. Unscrupulous compromises and compromise, the desire to live peacefully without offending anyone, the desire to gain favor in the name of one's own interests, the mixture of good and evil Confucius called hypocrisy and believed that hypocrisy is the enemy of virtue. Luo Niu, Chapter 17. Confucius hated hypocrisy because from the outside it seems that the thugs who profess him follow the path of the golden mean, but in fact violate it, and therefore are low people who undermine the principle of the golden mean. As a methodology, the way of the golden mean represents the absolutization of the dialectical category of measure and the unity of contradictions, that is, the state of equilibrium. Measure is the boundary beyond which a change in quantity entails a change in quality, while equilibrium too regarding both when exceeding the measure and not reaching it, it is possible to upset the balance of contradictions, cause their mutual transformation and bring the matter to qualitative changes. Confucius, who took the rules of conduct for the middle measure. This was the essence of the path of the golden mean. If we proceed from reality, consider transformations in time and space and skillfully use this methodology, then under certain conditions the questions of how to properly perform the work, how to maintain a balance between contradictions, how to make sure that the rational does not turn into its opposite, how to strengthen the good order, can be solved on the basis of this methodology. The rule of the golden mean, or how to find harmony in everything. What is the golden mean and why it is so important? The rule of the golden mean is a concept that means something between two extremes. As a rule, a person is accustomed to falling into extremes. This is due to a lack of understanding of the laws of life and the lack of ability to control your emotions, and, consequently, life. It is desirable to learn to adhere to the rules of the golden mean in absolutely all spheres, be it family, business, communication, and so on. If a person lives, constantly falling into extremes, his life begins to burst at the seams, absolutely in all areas. Extremes have never been helpful. If a person allows extremes only sometimes, this is not so critical. After all, we are living beings who are characterized by the manifestation of emotions. And we can't always contain them. Therefore, the rare assumption of extremes is quite acceptable. The main thing is that the extremes do not become a system. And in the system of your life should lie just the same rule of the golden mean. Let's try to figure out how to stick to it. How to learn to adhere to the rule of the golden mean. To learn to always and in everything to adhere to the rule of the golden mean, you just need to realize a few things. Understanding that yours is not going anywhere from you. It will be with you. Not yours will leave you anyway, no matter how much you chase him. With this point, I want to tell you this. Often in our time we see that a person in pursuit of money forgets about himself. For example, he works a lot and does not give himself time to rest. As a result, his body is depleted from overload, begins to hurt. And now the money he earns goes to treatment and recovery. And why was all this necessary? Wouldn't it be easier to stick to the middle? And to work hard, and give yourself time to rest and recuperate? This is the golden mean. Proper prioritization. If you, for example, have a family, then you are obliged to devote a sufficient amount of time to it. That is, you should not disappear around the clock at work or with friends in a bar, but devote time to family too. And you need to determine for yourself what is more important to you. And from this to start in making their decisions. Constantly strive to improve yourself. Here's what I mean. Managing your emotions is a very useful human skill. And if you strive for it, then this will be a huge plus for you. If you know how to manage your emotions, then you will fall into extremes less and less. And if you fall into extremes less often, it means that harmony in your life will become more and more. For each of our decisions, we are responsible to the universe. She gives us in return what we deserve. If we do the right thing in terms of the universe, it will thank us. How can it thank us? Everything in our lives will be fine. And our family will be harmonious, and children are healthy, and prosperity is stable, and real friends, and there are many opportunities. What we have depends solely on us and our choices. And the choice we make with you every second of our lives. We always make a choice how to react. So let's, friends, strive for a golden mean in everything, and life will respond to us with harmony in everything. Always maintain yourself in a state of the golden mean, in the state of a resource. Theta Healing will help you. Be harmonious. The rule of the golden mean, invest exactly as much as you really need. Sticking to the golden mean is very important that your life flows harmoniously and you do not create unnecessary stress for yourself. Remember how the Buddha came to the golden mean, having known luxury, he also knew the opposite side of life, austerity, poverty, rejection of the material. As he walked out to the river, he heard a mentor on a boat floating down the river telling the young musician, if you pull the string too hard, it will break, if it is too weak, it will rattle. This applies to absolutely everything. The question is, how are we going to determine how we pulled the string of our lives? Do we invest a lot in this or that or not enough? The main criterion is within us. The closer we are to our inner center, the better we recognize its signals and follow them, the more smoothly and harmoniously our life goes. For example, you are busy working on a project. But at the same time, you are not only an employee, you are also a person who, having a family, has worries and responsibilities. There is a need for rest finally. If you go too far in one direction, get involved in work so that coming home you just fall, and so not one day, but constantly, then there will come a time when your neighbors will get tired of this state of affairs, tension will arise at home, and instead of the desired rest you will get a lump of nerves and problems. And after that, you have to go to work again. You can imagine the mood with which. And if nothing is done to solve this situation, then the knot on your neck will tighten tighter. At first glance, it seems that taking on excessive obligations, there is no other way out than to lay down the bones to fulfill them. It's actually simpler. As soon as you begin to care not only about how to fulfill them, but also about your beloved, then the tightened knot will gradually be released. You're tired, your body is stiff, do some exercises. You are already working at a good pace, but you are brought additional tasks, which, with all your efforts, simply cannot be squeezed into one working day. Do not be afraid to inform your manager about it. It seems that if you start taking care of yourself, then your image of a wonderful reliable employee in the eyes of colleagues will deteriorate, but in fact everything happens exactly the opposite. So, no matter what you do, no matter what choice is in front of you, remember that first of all you are responsible for each of your actions not in front of people, near or far, but before the universe. And it is she who will respond to your actions. Through the people and situations around you. You take a step towards yourself from the position of healthy egoism, and suddenly you notice that the boss is carrying a pile of additional work not to you, but to your colleague. There can be as many such examples as you like. It's important that you keep a clear track of when you start to forget about yourself, your body, your emotions, your needs, and focus on something external, and when you notice it, you go back to yourself. Feel your body, your heart, your mind, your breath. And as for how to know if you are investing too little, it can be recognized when the reality you are trying to create, whether it's a job, a project, or a relationship, starts to creep at the seams. What we do not invest in, what we are not interested in, disappears by itself. What is intended for you you will get in any case. What is not yours, you will not be able to get even if you put a lot of effort. So is it even worth worrying about? Do what your heart tells you to do, go where it leads, and don't worry about the consequences. Expose them to the universe and you will see how easy, beautiful, and harmonious your life will become. Explaining the scheme of the relationship between the golden mean, opposites and extremes. PCPPLPLK cowardice, caution, courage, bravery. Bravery, recklessness, desperation, shyness, self-deprecation, clogging modesty. Pride of pride. Arrogance. Arrogance, altruism, selflessness, love for others, love, selfishness. Selfishness, extravagance, generosity, frugality, stinginess. Greed, gullibility, trust, vigilance, suspicion, gullibility, faith, doubt. Skepticism. Unbelief, good-naturedness, dreaminess, optimism, realism, sobriety, pessimism, dissolution in communication, solitude, loneliness, nationalism. Chauvinism, patriotism, internationalism, cosmopolitanism, sybaritism, lechery. Moderation, asceticism, shamelessness. Cynicism, relaxed shyness, timidity, shyness in pedagogy, dictate, despotism, tyranny, demanding sensitivity, connivance. In ancient Greece, the idea of a measure or a golden mean was one of the most important principles in the system of life principles. The motto "nothing too much, everything in moderation" was inscribed on the wall of the main Greek temple, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. The greatest philosopher of ancient Greece, Aristotle, developed a whole theory of the golden mean. And subsequently, philosophers repeatedly returned to this theory. A. Schopenhauer, for example, in support of the theory of the golden mean, cited the following considerations: all human perfection is related to some defect into which it can pass, but in the same way and, conversely, every flaw corresponds to a certain perfection. Therefore, the misconception that we sometimes fall into about a person is often based on the fact that at the beginning of acquaintance we confuse his shortcomings with related perfections or vice versa. That is why the cautious then seems to us a coward, the thrifty, stingy or the spendthrift, generous, rudeness, directness and frankness, arrogance, noble self-confidence. Zhongyun, the golden mean. I avoid excesses and look for a middle ground in everything. Zhongguo, literally translated as the middle state, is the name of China, whose great thinkers wished that it should also be the state of the golden mean. Synonymous with moderation and coherence of human actions with the forces of nature, the golden mean is not a fixed point between the two poles, but a center of attraction that elevates a person. To explain what it was, Chinese philosophers often resorted to the metaphor of shooting from the gut. The archer had to hit the bull's-eye exactly at the moment when the gong sounded. This required not only impeccable possession of the body, but also complete concentration. Like him, we must strive for a middle ground in everything and wait for the right moment to begin to act. What to strive for? I choose the targets as accurately as possible, and then pull the string and wait. I'm not in a hurry and I'm not impatient. I give credit to delicious food, but I don't overeat. I don't deny myself a glass of wine, but I don't get drunk. To educate is to be able to fight the golden mean. I know how to punish my children, but also to encourage them. What to avoid? I do not flaunt my wealth, I do not boast about my successes. This is how I manage to avoid the envy of others. I don't get scattered on a lot of things. I set one goal and don't quit until I finish it. I don't scream, but I know how to make myself listen. I'm not jubilant, but I know how to appreciate what I have. The golden mean is the highest virtue of all, but has long been rare among men. Confucius.